It's DOScember! The traditional time of the year when YouTubers all gather around their various editing machines and produce videos all loosely themed around the topic of DOS. Yes, you may have spotted this one trending on YouTube, hopefully. Me and lots of other YouTubers who are frankly much more talented have put together various videos about DOS. And for my entry, I'm going to do a video about the wonderful wired world of DOS networking. Those of you who grew up in the modern era of internet connectivity and modern operating systems might be surprised to know that MS-DOS didn't come with any networking support whatsoever. In fact, Bill Gates hadn't even heard of LANs until a little visit to Acorn Computers some point after MS-DOS was first released. It soon became apparent though in the corporate world, computers were going to need connecting to each other using a LAN. And because DOS had no default way of doing networking, suddenly it had a lot of ways of doing networking. One soon started to dominate over all others in the form of Novell Netware. Now, it's not like Novell were the only ones to start with. There were a ton of competitors. There was Banyan with its Vines product, IBM and Microsoft together with LAN Manger. There was even stuff based around packet drivers that would let you use an IP stack in Unix networking. But Netware and its little protocol stack IPX soon started to overtake them all, to the point where Novell pretty much dominated the market. Novell started life off as a company making CP/M-based machines, and it did not go well. So Novell did what we now refer to as a pivot, which is business talk for, oh, that plan's not working, let's do something else before we go bust. And that brand new plan was to get itself into the new emerging market of local area network technologies. It'd be fair to say that plan went pretty well for quite a long time. Now, the first version of Netware had some features that, well, Netware would keep pretty much throughout the entire of its life. Also, it was very different from what would come later. In terms of the things that remained the same, the first version of Netware introduced IPX. Short for Inter-Network Packet Exchange, but in the 90s, basically, it was the network protocol that made LAN gaming go. In the Netware stack of stuff, IPX fills the role that IP does in modern internet stuff. And a number of other network protocols would be layered on top of that for routing, file, print, etc. Where things would vary a lot from what was to come, the first version of Netware had its own custom hardware for the server, based on the Motorola 68000, and its own custom LAN technology. Netware version 1 did pretty well for Novell, allowing the company to stay afloat and continue working on Netware. However, their second release, which would be a lot more like all the other releases to come, is where Netware really started to get big. Netware 286 version 2, as they dubbed the second version of Netware, as you can guess from the title, didn't run on a proprietary Motorola 68000 box, but instead could be run on any 286 machine. They also at this point did away with a special proprietary Netware-owned network technology, and instead embraced things like ArcNet and Ethernet and Token Ring, all of which had started to gain some form of acceptance in the market, with ArcNet taking an early lead, with Ethernet soon overtaking it, and Token Ring still just being Token Ring and doing its tokeny ringany thing off by itself in some high-end IBM corner. Netware 2's ability to use a regular 286 PC as a server would set the course for all future versions of Netware. Most network operating systems at the time used their own proprietary hardware, just like Netware had done with version 1. But with this new version, Novell had really changed things and opened it up so you could just use regular hardware. For those supporting Netware, this was a real advantage, because your hardware knowledge that you used to maintain most of your clients was also now the same hardware knowledge you could use for the server. This also really helped get the cost of things down as well. This really helped contribute towards the success of Netware. The client was also a big part of Netware's success as well. The IPX stack they created that made the whole client go used a surprisingly small amount of memory. This was really important back at this point in time with DOS, because you only had 640k of base memory, so a lot of network admin time was spent trying to get as much out of that 640k of memory and into high mem, so you could run DOS applications that really needed most of the 640k. I mean, PCs did have more than 640k of memory, it's just they only had 640k of base memory, which is what most earlier DOS applications used. Following on from Netware 2, you'll be unsurprised to discover they released Netware 3. This time they very much embraced the newly released 386 CPU, which must have been a bit of a pain for them, given that they'd written the previous one in assembler, but there we go. And this is the one that really established Netware as basically the dominant network operating system for the PC. Now, it's hard to overstate how dominant Novell were at this point in this market. For example, their qualification, CNE, the Novell Certified Engineer, became the standard networking qualification, in the same way that being a Cisco Certified Engineer would later on. And this is probably a good moment to look at what Netware could actually do. As you guessed, it did all the regular file and print stuff you would expect. So you could map network directories as a drive letter in DOS and then access them. You could map various LPT devices in DOS to a printer. And this was the point where you started to get big network laser printers that had their own built-in network card and knew how to talk directly to Netware, or little boxes to make regular printers become network printers, like HP's Jet Direct. Netware also had a few other built-in little features up its sleeve as well. For example, you could do notifications, where you could send the message and it would pop up on someone's screen, which is a great way for network admins to tell stuff, and also a really great way for you and your friends to irritate the hell out of each other at university as well. Netware also had its own email system built in, using something they referred to as a mail directory, which was basically a file-based way of doing email, which clients like Pmail for DOS and Pmail for Windows supported. Now this wasn't regular internet email to start with, this was just essentially emailing people on the same server as you. But Netware had a concept of Netware loadable modules, where you could load other little services into your Netware server. And one of the popular ones for doing SMTP email was Mercury, which let you use the whole maildir thing, but if you put in an internet email address, then it would do SMTP and send that email out to the internet and accept inbound emails as well. Novell unsurprisingly started to develop their own add-on products for Netware as well, which you would load as one of these modules, like GroupWise, which was Novell's group mail system that did email, calendar, shared contacts, that sort of thing. Now again, if you're thinking, this would let you email people on the internet? No. It was targeting internal company email using X400, you know, that email standard that nobody uses anymore. GroupWise did eventually come with an SMTP module, which was the most difficult thing in the world to configure. I mean, if you were a fellow GroupWise admin, you have my sympathies. That thing was a pig. Speaking of pigs, even Oracle trotted out a version of its database for Netware as well, which, oh boy, I mean, Oracle's not easy to use normally, but the Netware version, dear God. Now this does point to one of the frailties in Netware as well. Netware loadable modules didn't really have a lot of protection from each other or the rest of the server, and if they weren't written really well, they tended to crash Netware for you. As a Netware admin, the thing you really dreaded seeing was the abend message, which is essentially the abnormal termination. It meant your Netware server was dead and reboot. This was basically Netware's equivalent of the blue screen of death. Now, if you loaded certain applications, this was an error message you got to see alarmingly often. Oracle, we're looking at you. Right, it's time to get a Netware install running. Don't worry, I won't sit here and make you watch the whole thing, but we'll talk a bit more about the history of Novell while we wait for this thing to do something. Netware had clients for multiple operating systems, not just DOS. It supported Apples and a whole bunch of various Unixes as well. But it would be fair to say that most clients for a Netware server were MS-DOS based. In fact, Netware had one neat trick up its sleeve for DOS clients. If you popped an RPL boot ROM in your network card, you could run your DOS machine without a hard drive and get the whole thing to boot directly off the Netware server, where drive C would essentially be a network volume. Now this meant that a whole bunch of institutions like universities could deploy a lot of DOS machines that never had a hard drive in them but just an RPL boot ROM, and essentially it would boot off Netware at power on. The university I attended did this as well. In fact, at one point it proudly boasted it was the largest remote boot network in Europe. As a user of that network, I'm not sure that's something they should have been so proud of, because it could take 10-15 minutes just to get a DOS prompt. And then woe betide you if you asked it to load Windows 3.1. I mean, that could take you another 10 to 15 minutes. I mean, that boast should have been, we cheaped out more on hard drives than any other university. Now this dominance Novell had in the corporate network world explains why it was so dominant in the gaming world as well. Pretty much every early to mid-90s game that had networking in it used Novell's IPX stack to do their networking. It's simply that it was the most dominant technology around for doing this at the time. So Doom, Doom 2, Duke Nukem 3D, all these things we play at a LAN party all used IPX to communicate with each other. The other way in which Novell's influence was felt in this space was with the NE2000 network card. If you were going to LAN parties back in the 90s and playing some of these things, the network card you were looking for was an NE2000 compatible one. And pretty much every manufacturer's one was, as, well, if you weren't, not many people were going to buy your card, not in the corporate world, not in the home world. So you'd all go around to someone's house with your NE2000 network card, you get a bit of FinCoax and you connect all the PCs together, shove a terminator on each end of the cable and away you'd go. Now some of you younger viewers might be thinking, why didn't you just use the internet? Well, we didn't have it, and even when we did start to get it, we had to dial it up using a modem, and my god was it slow and laggy and really bad for gaming. So even as the internet started to become more and more important, we were still LAN party gaming and we were still using IPX. As we all started to get home broadband though, things started to change. Right, now we got Netware server installed, it's time to have a little play with the client. Now you can see here I've got my 90s luggable PC here, and it's time to get the Netware client installed on it. I won't bore you by showing you the install screen, but I will show you the little batch file it leaves behind at the end, which shows us how the Netware stack gets going. Right, as you can see, we got our first line LSL, then NE2000, that's the network driver. Then we have IPX ODI, that's the IPX stack, and then finally VLM, which is the actual Netware client. Right, let's skip things forwards a little bit so you can see the Netware client load. The first couple of bits where it loads the network card driver and IPX sail along quite quickly. It then takes a little bit longer to load VLM.com, because that's the part of the network client that actually tries to attach to the Netware server, so it hangs for a little while it finds itself a server to connect to. There you see, it's found RetroBytes, good server name is that, and then the rest of the machine boot continues on. Once connected to the server, the Netware client maps drive F to one of the volumes on the Netware server. That volume contains all the utilities such as the logging command and stuff like that allows us to actually log ourselves into the Netware server and get access to other volumes and printers and stuff like that. Right, here's me trying to log in as admin. As you can see, it takes a little while. I mean, it only runs at 10 megabits. Once logged in, it maps a couple of drive letters for you, and then you're ready to start using your Netware file server. Now, as Netware is no longer the dominant network technology it was, we all know things clearly must have gone a bit wrong for Novell at some point in time. Well, things started to change from around the same time that, well, the internet was starting to become a thing for most people. IPX, which had been its great advantage, was starting to be seen as a bit of a liability because it wasn't IP and internet based. And although Novell started trying to integrate IP into its Netware operating system, and by version 5 it was pretty much there, things were also getting a little bit too late for Novell. The other thing that really did for Novell was Microsoft. Microsoft had its new networking product, NT Server, and it was determined it was going to get some market share by fair means or foul. And well, this being 90s Microsoft, we all know they opted for foul, right? When they released Windows 95, this was a really good opportunity for Microsoft to really stick the knife into Novell, and they did it in grand style. See, Microsoft knew that if they just didn't support Novell at all, well, that might actually harm adoption of Windows 95 in the corporate environment, because, well, Novell was that dominant. So they included a Netware client, and what they included was a terrible Netware client. See, instead of doing it properly through their NDIS networking stack like all their other networking, they used the whole DOS real mode ODI driver thing to make it go, so it still ran in 16-bit mode. The other thing they made sure was that it didn't support long file names. The Netware could actually do long file names. I mean, it had been doing it quite happily for Apple's and for Unix clients, so all it needed was a small Netware loadable module to enable it for DOS clients. But Microsoft made sure not to support it in their Novell client. They even went so far as in the Microsoft Certified Professional Qualification, they asked the question, can Netware do long file names? And if you put yes, they marked that as wrong. Now, to redress this situation, Novell created their own client, Client 32. And here's where things took a turn for the negative for Novell. Client 32 was not great. Client 32 was slow. Client 32 used quite a lot of memory. Client 32 was clearly not very easy for Novell to write. Microsoft didn't exactly well document the things they needed to make it work very well. But this wasn't seen as a Microsoft problem, this was seen as a Novell problem. Now, it took Novell a while to iron out these problems with Client 32, but by the time they did, the damage was already done. System admins had stopped seeing Novell in quite the same light they'd saw them before. If you connected your Windows 95 client to an NT server, these were not problems you had. Now, it's not to say that things changed overnight for Novell. Novell released Netware 4, which introduced that whole new directory concept, which is a way of managing users and applications and all sorts in a tree. It was a really good idea. I really like it. I mean, other Novell admins might well disagree. But Microsoft rubbished this concept and said, who wants a tree system? No, what you want is our domain model. It's so much better. That is until they released Windows 2000 and it came with a tree model and, you know, they shut up from then on in. As the 90s progressed, market share for Novell declined, and still on into the 2000s. Two things really did for them. Microsoft and its Windows NT Server product really started to steal, well, most of Novell's market, and then came along Linux, and that made things even worse for them because, well, it started taking market share. And Novell decided to embrace Linux, even going so far as to purchase the SUSE Linux distribution. And it ported all of its Netware products across to Linux as well. But it was all a bit too late. Microsoft had already grabbed a lot of what was Novell's core business, and Linux and various open source packages running on top of it had kind of stolen everything else. So these days you won't see many corporate environments running Novell. But where you will find it is if you want to have a LAN party, 1990s style. Well, that about wraps it up for my contribution to DOScember. DOScember? Yeah, I think I pronounced that correctly. DOScember. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much for watching. And if you like this video, why not share it with other people you think might also enjoy it? As sharing it with people you don't think would enjoy it is probably a way to lose friends. And if you're feeling in a generous mood, why not click the subscribe button, because subscriptions really do make a big difference to a small little channel like this one. You also might want to consider gently clicking the bell icon, so the subscription button does the thing you assumed it was going to do.